following your work for a lot of years, and particularly that video that you put out where there were like 400 and some people that worked for the government, and they all stood up at the podium and they spoke. I was amazed that you put that out there. But I read an article that you had put out talking about Buzz Aldrin. He had died back in November, and you put the article out about his death and how his family couldn't speak about.
Oh, I think that was Neil Armstrong, actually.
Neil Armstrong.
Yeah. The first man to walk on the moon. Yeah.
Exactly, and you said that when he landed, he saw something that he couldn't talk about?
Yes.
What was it? Yeah.
This is a really great question about what really happened. You know, my uncle worked for Grumman, that became Northrop Grumman, and Grumman had the contract to build the lunar module. It landed, a funny looking thing that looked like a spider. It landed on the moon in 1969 on July 20th or whatever it was. The first two men on the moon were Neil Armstrong and after him Buzz Aldrin.
Yeah.
And back when we were doing these briefings for Congress, and in fact even before then, the Asilomar gathering in 1995, we reached out to Neil Armstrong because I knew from contacts and family that when we landed on the moon, we weren't alone.
Okay.
And that Neil Armstrong, there were two people who've been on my team for many years who were good friends of his family. And so we reached out to him and invited him to come to those events, and he politely declined and told us that it was made very clear to him and the other Apollo astronauts who witnessed this first event, where when we landed at the crater on the moon, the rim at the top of the crater was, quote, crowded with UFOs, the craft that were up there, multiple of them, and that these were filmed. And that I know people personally who've seen that film footage. And that's why the film footage that came back to the Earth, and we did go to the moon, but some of the footage, it doesn't make sense because the flag is moving. Now the reason for that, and this is where people say we didn't go to the moon, it was all hoax and filmed in a basement up in New York. The truth is we went, but during the lunar orbiter, going back before the Apollo mission, we actually were circling the Earth taking the first early digital photographs. And as you know from the testimony of Disclosure Project witness Carl Wolf, there were structures on the moon that were artificial. Some were newer and some were very ancient. And so they knew the covert programs, and these images were being downloaded to out here at Langley, not the CIA headquarters, Langley Air Force Base, to a compartmented operation run by the National Security Agency that was then sequestered away from the other NASA scientists. But the people running that project, the deep black people in those projects, knew that it was likely we were going to encounter something not of this world or a UFO when we landed. Therefore, they had filmed some footage that they could splice in if something started happening. So during the live transmission, if something started happening, there's a delay that went through this National Security Agency filter, and they could immediately, instantly put in. And that's why there's a couple frames where the American flag is moving. Well, there's no atmosphere on the moon, okay? Which was the one mistake they made in that whole plan. That's the telltale giveaway. Now, some people have taken that, the conspiracy theorists have said, we didn't even go to the moon. We did go to the moon. But they knew that it was likely there were going to be ETVs, extraterrestrial vehicles up there. And so when they stepped out, of course, you know, and we're approaching actually, before they even landed, they saw them. So they were already with this sort of pre-prepared film that looked very, very good, except for this one error. And so Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin know for a fact. Now, Neil Armstrong said, look, you know, if I were to go forward and talk about what actually happened, I've been told, Neil Armstrong said this to us, that my wife, my children, and my grandchildren would all be killed, that they would take us out somehow, some terrible accident. And he says, I'm not going to talk about it. Now, Buzz Aldrin has just basically he sort of had a nervous breakdown after this and was actually at an Air Force facility. I know a man that was there with him, and he confided that this is also what happened. I also know Buzz Aldrin's sister, who pulled me aside and says, yes, you're absolutely right, that is what happened, but it's not my job to out Buzz Aldrin on this. If he's ready and he's able and allowed, he will speak about it. But you have to understand, enormous pressure was put on these men never to speak about what actually happened.
Can we speculate on whether those ships came from here or from there?
And this is the follow-on question: were those ships that were around the moon at that time in 1969 extraterrestrial or man-made reproduction vehicles using anti-gravity? I don't know. It could have been either. But I think probably they weren't ours, only because those folks would not have wanted to risk exposing that they were there with cameras rolling. Okay, because that would have, of course, ended the fact that they have these secret aircraft, a secret space force.
They would have watched TV and knew that there was a space shuttle.
So that's one of the problems. That's, you know, I've thought about it, and the answer is I don't know, but from a logical point of view, I doubt it was ours. Okay. Now, you know, one of the things that Neil Armstrong was overheard saying, and this was reported in Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret, is that Neil Armstrong stated that we were essentially warned off the moon. That, in other words, these civilizations did not want us going to other moons or planets to colonize them with the consciousness of nationalism and the Cold War. Because remember, the Apollo project was really a proxy for the Cold War. The United States was in a complete panic when Sputnik overtook our space program, the Soviets. And so the race to the moon was part of, and always was part of, the military competition between two huge superpowers, the old Soviet Union and the United States of America. And so when we went there, but we went there not as a peaceful world civilization, but as a competing Cold War effort that were armed with thousands of thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, pointed at each other. That was not the consciousness that the ETs want to see us going into space with. They want us going into space with the consciousness of peace and cooperation, not militarism and war. So that's sort of your, let's say if there's an entry ticket to space exploration, that's the main one. And we haven't quite reached that point, have we? So I think that's why Neil Armstrong said, I don't know what was said or done, or what was done by these craft, but he said it made it very clear that they weren't real happy that we were going there in this way. And that's, in my opinion, why we wound down the space program to the moon. You know, my uncle was involved with this, and there was all kinds of plans to put colonies there and buildings and have, you know, people living in sort of like domes like they have out at the biosphere in Arizona and what have you, and all that was shut down. Now, the excuse they gave was budgetary cuts, but I don't think it was budgetary cuts. I think it was because, you know, it was quite clear that we were going out there immaturely as a warring civilization and not as a peaceful world civilization, which is the requirement. Yes, ma'am.
But Kennedy had talked to the Soviets about going jointly. Was that a peaceful thing together, or what prompted him? What did he know, or what was behind his question? Because he took a lot of flack.
Yeah, Kennedy did want to do an international, from the beginning, space program. And, you know, when he was assassinated, Khrushchev wept and stated, now we will not have world peace. Because Kennedy, and actually Bobby Kennedy said this, Bobby Kennedy Jr., who I've met, said this recently on a CNN interview, is that his intent was, in his second term, to get completely out of Vietnam, to do a cooperative, and to make total peace with the Soviet Union. Now, of course, there goes $1 trillion in military industrial intelligence spending. And they were not happy about that. He was also going to disclose this UFO issue. And I think there were a number of reasons why, he was just not willing to succumb to their view of how the world needed to progress with endless conflict. And that's why there was no second term of Jack Kennedy, in my opinion. Now, from what I know, and this is also somewhat corroborated, although in a bit of a titillating way, with the document I got from the National Security Agency contact I have. That's the Marilyn Monroe document. And in the Marilyn Monroe document, it's a top secret document that was handed off to me, never declassified, authenticated by a man who used to be General Odom, O-D-O-M's right-hand guy, who was National Security Agency head for years. And in this document, it was a wiretap summary that the CIA wiretapping a bunch of people, but mainly Marilyn Monroe, who, as you know, had an affair with Jack Kennedy and also with Bobby Kennedy. And they knew it was becoming too public, and so in 1962 or whenever it was, they cut that off. And she was furious, so she was calling up Bobby Kennedy, this Attorney General, and an art dealer named Rothberg in New York, and other people, saying that she was going to hold a news conference to tell Jack Kennedy, to tell the world what Jack Kennedy had told her about, quote, objects from outer space that were recovered in New Mexico in the 40s, clear reference to Roswell, as well as some other matters. That wiretap summary is dated the day before they found her dead. Now, when I brought this up there was a famous actor and singer named Burl Ives, who used to be on our executive committee, and he was friends with Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor. And Burl Ives, when I showed this document to him, he just held his head. He says, we all know Marilyn was killed and that it wasn't an overdose. We didn't know why. And he was a 33rd degree Mason. Burl Ives was. He has a room in this building next door, the big 33rd degree Masonic temple next door. And I said, yeah, well, Marilyn didn't know what kind of big toes and big gorillas she was stepping on. But of course, the whole world would have covered that press conference. It would have been sensational. And so Marilyn Monroe almost certainly was assassinated because she was going way too far off the reservation. And this document has the proper project code names and code numbers for that era. Project Moondust, Project 46, some of these key project code names and code numbers for the early 60s. I have that document. It's in my first book. It's there for anyone to read. It's explosive, and it's dispositive, actually. But unfortunately for Marilyn Monroe, she didn't realize that this was non-trivial. This is not a trivial thing to hold a press conference, a person of her stardom in that era. I mean, she was huge, talking about these specific issues because she had learned that apparently in pillow talk with Jack Kennedy. And so it cost her life in order to keep that quiet.